Today I'm heading out to a nature reserve close to where I live to talk to you about the setups I use for wildlife videography with the Lumix G9. What do I bring and how do I use it? Let's talk about it. A what's in my camera bag video I don't really see myself making because it's different every time and it really depends on what I'm going to be shooting. It's mostly a start from scratch kind of thing when I pack my bag. Unfortunately, there isn't much wildlife to film this beautiful foggy morning. Might also be because I'm talking. So I think it's a good time to talk about my wildlife G9 setup. So let's talk about my basic simple setup first. It's obviously the G9 with a SmallRig Cage with 100 to 400, the Deity D4 mini on top for the audio. I do prefer the G9 without the cage when going handheld, but I usually want to attach things like a microphone or my Atomos Ninja. So the G9 basically lives in this cage, but every once in a while when I really plan on going handheld, I'll remove the cage and I will just use this basic setup and put the microphone in the hot shoe of the G9. I use a simple tripod with a ball head. I really prefer looking through the viewfinder. So what I do is I loosen the ball head, and when I look through the viewfinder I can pan and tilt while still keeping it steady. It's steadier than using it handheld. And I always have the screen flipped out to the side, so my nose has a bit more room here when I look through the viewfinder. And what I like about this setup is that I can easily switch to completely handheld, and this microphone is not in the way of my forehead, and I hold the setup by the tripod mount of the lens. I particularly like the placement of the tripod mount because I can hold it here and at the same time use the focus ring. The focus ring is really nice, especially because on the G9 and also in the GH6 you can set this focus ring to linear. I actually talked about it in my first video on this channel, so check it out if you would like to know more about that. The zoom ring, well, I've talked about it in an earlier video, is really stiff. So that's not really something I do like this. Usually I just slide it out like this because it's just easier and quicker than the zoom ring. I also don't zoom during a shot, so it doesn't really matter. I use variable ND filters. In this case I'm using a K&F Concept variable ND, which is convenient because it's a variable ND. It's okay, there is a bit of a color cast and it's not the sharpest. I think I'll make a dedicated video about ND filters. But for now this works. So how do I set my camera up for shooting wildlife? Well, I've got a preset that I saved to the SD card for wildlife. When I'm shooting in tripod is. When I'm shooting in 25 frames per second, I shoot in vlog. When I go into higher frame rates to 50 frames per second or into variable frame rate, it becomes 8-bit and I switch to the natural profile. I have the ISO set to auto usually with a limit of 3200, and I use manual focus most of the time, with the exception of using the touch to focus on the screen or back button focus that I use to quickly focus on something, and then I will adjust with manual focus. So that's really my basic setup for filming wildlife. This is obviously my go-to lens for wildlife. It's also the only super telephoto lens I currently own, and I think it's a very nice lens. So let's move on to my full setup for times when I can be in one place for a while, or I want to shoot a specific scene. Let's see what that setup looks like. So I'm in a spot where I'm gonna stay for a while. So I'm gonna build up and show you the whole rig, the fully built out rig. It's a different day that I'm recording this because I messed up the second half of the previous recording. It's really cold today. We've had some months with temperatures above average, and it's now suddenly quite cold, and I'm not really used to it. Anyway, I'm gonna start building the rig, but before I do that, I wanna tell you about the very first part really, and that's this tripod. It's a Sirui SH15, I believe. Yeah, SH15 with a fluid head. And the nice thing about this is that it's a video tripod, and it has a bowl on the bottom. And if you loosen the knob, you can level it like this without having to adjust the legs, which is incredibly useful. And that way, when you pan, it always stays level. So that, I think that's really a requirement when you do videography, wildlife videography, and you have to follow things or you want to make pans. A tripod like this with a head like this is really necessary. On top of it, I've got a Andoer Arca-Swiss quick release mounted to the original plate of this tripod. Okay, so let me build up the rig on this. I start off with a simple base with 15mm rods and a base plate, a Niceyrig Baseplate, with again an Andoer quick release, Arca-Swiss quick release on top, and a simple follow focus and a simple lens support. On the back I have a V-mount attachment, and that goes on to the tripod first. Okay, so let me get my G9 and mount that on top and then go from there. No battery. Okay, now that the camera is on there, I'm gonna build the rest out, and once I have it built up, I'll tell you what it is and how I use it. Okay, so let me walk you through this setup. Let's start with the audio. The microphone I'm using is the Sennheiser MKE600, and that's plugged straight into my camera. But I usually also bring my Zoom H5 audio recorder, and I use that for getting ambient sound with either the stereo mic on top, or I plug in the MKE600 and I can place it elsewhere to get some ambient audio away from the camera. So I can put it on the tripod and put it somewhere in the field to get some nice audio. So that's the audio. On top I have a SmallRig Top Handle, which I really like using because when I want to take it off, I can take it off on the top handle, and I can attach other things to the top handle, such as the Atomos Ninja that I have on top now. The reason that I have an Atomos Ninja on top is that it makes it a lot easier to manually focus, because the screen is bigger and the focus peaking is a lot more visible, clearly visible on an Atomos Ninja. Also, I really like to shoot with a big screen, a bigger screen than the camera's LCD. And on top of that, I can record in ProRes if I want to. And the other reason is that if I want to shoot in vlog in higher frame rates, I can, because the G9 puts out a 10-bit 422 in higher frame rates, such as 50 and 60p, to an Atomos Ninja V. So that way I can still shoot vlog and I don't have to switch profiles. I'm powering the G9 just with its own battery because it lasts pretty long, battery life is pretty good. And I'm powering the Ninja V through an FX Lion V-mount battery mounted on the back here. I can easily take it off. And the Ninja has the battery eliminator in it. I also use a follow focus wheel because it makes it easier to nail the focus. I find it convenient, but that's really personal preference. And then lastly, there is a matte box on the front. And you might think that seems a bit like overkill, but it's really not. There are a few reasons I use a matte box in this situation. The first being that it protects the lens, the front element, from rain or the ND filter that's on it. So if I'm shooting in rain, the lens won't get wet and it's protected. It's also protection from flaring. And you'd think, well, this lens comes with a sun hood, why don't you use that? Well, there's a simple reason for that. When I have a variable ND filter on the front, I can't use the sun hood. It doesn't fit over the ND filter. And even if it did, it's really hard to poke your finger into the sun hood and adjust your variable ND that way. So I find it much easier with a matte box like this. It's now obviously way too high up, but I did that for this video. But when I'm actually shooting wildlife, it's of course a lot lower. And I have a nice big screen to look at and a handle on the tripod to do the pans and the tilts. And it's really stable like this. And I can easily focus on things. I just find this to be a very convenient setup. This is obviously not a setup I'm gonna be walking around with. It's just for situations like this where you're gonna be staying somewhere for a while and you have the time and space to set it up. So that's my fully rigged out wildlife setup. I hope these setups I've shown have given you some ideas about your setup, how to set your wildlife rig up. And I hope this video was helpful. If so, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel and maybe hit that notification bell. And I hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching. I've made a review video on it, so if you want to learn about more,